Hello, everyone. This is Sheniynah Richardson of SheRich Educational Consulting here with blog number 18, Task Focus Reading. Now, throughout my blogs, you may have heard me mention a reading task, and you may have wondered, what's a reading task? What's the purpose of it? Well, a reading task is specific in that it gives the student directions on how they are to process the reading. For example, you would not read a cookbook the same way you read the Bible, and you would not read a magazine with the same intent that you read a novel. Basically, a reading task answers these questions. What am I supposed to pay attention to? What am I supposed to get out of this reading? What is to be gained from a focused reading task? What is the purpose? Well, I have found that reading tasks A simplify the reading process for struggling learners. B, it increases comprehension. C, it builds problem-solving skills. D, it suits the platform of engaged learning. E, promotes kinesthetic learning and knowledge retention. Now, you may be thinking, that all sounds good on paper, but I need a demonstration. Hence, the purpose of this blog. So, here we go. The first thing you need to know about task-focused reading is how much reading should be assigned. The second thing you should know about task-based reading is how much time should be spent on the read. So, I will give a brief estimate, which will be around 3 to 5 minutes per paragraph. Now, the next thing to consider is the chunking and the pacing. And please note that it may take some students longer to finish a reading task than others, but I will get back to that in a minute. Let's talk about the chunking and the pacing. Now, the chunking and the pacing places a struggling reader at ease during the process of word recognition. It is also helpful in the avenue of goal setting. So students struggling with the depths of their reading attention span are increasingly ready to conform to the idea of, if I read for X amount of time, then I get to take a break. So you get a reward by reading through the time that is assigned. It is also important to note that scaffolded, chunked, and timed reading requires a recap. And earlier I mentioned that all students may not finish in the time that you allot, and that's where the recap comes in, because the recap ensures that students have obtained the necessary info to not only comprehend the text, but to 1, solve a problem, 2, argue a position, 3, create a product in the very end. For these things to occur, it is necessary for students to read the text more than once. Don't panic though. I know I just mentioned a reread. I know what I said. But it is possible to get students to read a text more than once. And I'll show you. This is the finesse that I talked about in my blog number 2. So these are classroom tested ways to foster engagement and learning joy through task-focused reading. Set the mood is what I call this strategy. The trick to this tip is to have your students read with a slip of colored paper in their hands to help them navigate through the text, something like a bookmark. The colored paper should correspond to the mood. If the mood is sad, let's say blue. If the mood is exciting, let's say orange, peaceful, green, funny, pink. So the reading task would be to scan paragraphs 1 through 4 and jot words on the paper strip that match the mood. Then you move to the subsequent paragraphs. Look at paragraph 5 on your colored piece of paper. Write the words from the text that connotate a whatever mood that you're working on at that time. If the passage has varying moods, continue to have your students to read and jot related words on the color strips. Now this, in sum, gets your students to read the same text multiple times for an increased comprehension. Now, to make this lesson successful, it is necessary to preview your teaching materials and troubleshoot potential conflicts. Now, what does this have to do with reading and comprehension? Well, this task basically gets students to read, okay? Then they comprehend what they read because they're reading and they're writing and they're making use of what they're reading. They're digesting it, they're processing, they're actually doing something actively with the information. And this is also a good strategy because students are not as focused on sentence structure and recall, so the anxiety associated with reading is reduced, and reading becomes more of a game or a challenge to be resolved. Another strategy is for the teacher to highlight keywords that are unfamiliar to students. Now, the reading task would then be to use context evidence to determine the meanings of the highlighted words using contextual evidence. When I assigned this task, my students were not allowed to use dictionaries. However, they could work together as a group to problem solve, which is also a college and career ready Common Core standard. Again, this puts the focus on solving a problem rather than sentence structure and word recall. For example, when I taught from the text of Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, my 9th graders were like, "We read this 100 times. I don't want to read it anymore." And I said, "Okay, then can someone tell me what the I Have a Dream speech is about?" I had several students tell me that Martin Luther King was a slave and he was speaking out against slavery. I kid you not. I literally fell on the floor and rolled across the classroom with my slacks on and my button-down shirt. Yes, I rolled across the floor. The kids were like, What? What's wrong with you? Why are you doing that?" I got off the floor finally after having my dramatic fit, and I started pretending as if I was crying. And my students were steadily saying, What's the matter? What's wrong? What's going on?" So after I regained my composure, I composed myself to say Martin Luther King was not a slave. He was a civil rights activist. Then a student said, "Slavery happened during the same time civil rights was going on, right?" I could not hide the disappointment on my face, and I painfully answered, slavery happened before the civil rights era. I took the remainder of the class period to give them the brief history on the Revolutionary War, the Emancipation Proclamation, women's suffrage, Jim Crow, all the way up to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. Nevertheless, it was an exhausting day. Apparently, they were not ready to reread this speech. So that night, I took the speech home and I was like, how am I going to teach this lesson? I don't want my students to miss the message again. As I read the speech, I started to mark up words that I was sure that would catch my students off guard and that they would not necessarily know the meanings of those words. Then I came up with the idea while I'm processing the information to teach vocabulary before we tackle the reading. So I copied the annotated version and distributed it to my students. I gave them the task to define the highlighted words using context clues, but no dictionaries were allowed. Now, my students couldn't define all the words, but they could define a few. So as I went to the whiteboard, I asked who had a definition for the first word, the second word, the third word, and so on and so forth, just like that. If the class couldn't provide an answer, I didn't write anything. I only wrote the answers that they could provide. So, after the provided answers were written, I went back to the blank spaces and I asked the students to read the sentence in which the sentence from the passage in which the word was found. As a class, we brainstormed what the word could possibly mean. I wrote down the answers provided and drew organizers so that the students could visualize the relationship among these words and the text. Now, during the process, I had a student ask, well, Miss Richardson, wouldn't it just be easier to tell us what the words mean? And I was like, oh no, you're going to have to work for this. You guys put me to work yesterday stating that Martin Luther King was a slave. So, oh no, I will not just give you the answers. We spent the remainder of the class period deciphering vocabulary. I had students copy the definitions and thinking grams into their notes. The next phase of instruction was to connect all the information to convey the centralized message of the historical speech. I particularly enjoyed teaching the I Have a Dream speech because of the rich vocabulary that is within. The symbolism, the rhetoric, and the structure of the speech, it was strategically arranged to support the idea that certain people were denied access to equal opportunity despite the constitutional amendments and the Emancipation Proclamation. Even though I till the soil for planting, in the minds of my students, the real work had yet to begin because remember, we still have not dived into the speech paragraph by paragraph. As a class, we did a read aloud, paragraph by paragraph. We discussed the central idea of each paragraph by paragraph. As we read, I had students make margin notes connecting the defined keywords to each paragraph as we built our point. By the time we finished the read, it was time to test the knowledge. At this point, most teachers would assign an open-ended response question sheet or provide a multiple choice question quiz. However, I spent a great deal going through these paragraphs and on the vocabulary, so I wanted to ultimately challenge myself to see if this measure had actually worked and if the students really understood what this speech was about. So, what I assigned is what I consider the epitome of learning, which is to apply this information to everyday life and make relevant connections, okay? Because my students were detached and they thought that civil rights happened, back in the slavery days. So, the pressure was on me to make sure that they had the correct information. So during one of our brainstorming and open discussion points that was made while we went paragraph by paragraph, a student gave an example of a cell phone being disconnected. It was noted that if you have a cell phone, that it would be difficult to socialize and participate in what was happening around you. You'll be left out while everyone else moves on with life. So I took that comment and I ran with it. The formative assessment was to write an essay comparing Dr. King's examples from the speech to having a disconnected cell phone. And guess what? It worked. They were eager to write about how they felt with their cell phone and how they felt without it. So it was rich content, and I had no trouble getting my students started on this because this was something that they wanted to speak about. So for my students with IEPs or individualized education plans or learning plans, whatever you want to call them, scaffolding was needed to prepare for the write. So at the top left of the notebook paper, I had my students write disconnected cell phone service. And to the top right, I had them write being treated unfairly. So beneath the left column, I had them write a list of how things would be not to have cell phone service. Okay, so they did very well on that. And on the adjacent side, I had students write a list of things that Dr. King used to show that the practices in the United States were unequal and unfair from the I Have a Dream speech. I then provided sentence stems, whereas my students with accommodations merely has to fill in the blanks with the information they listed from the table. And just a quick note, just because a student does not have accommodations does not mean that you do not provide accommodations for them. They just have an undiagnosed disability or what have you, but you still approach it the same way and provide the same support even if they are not given accommodations on paper. Okay, all right. So in sum, the experience I had with the task focused reading was very successful, thereby, thus, and therefore, I am sharing it with you, and I hope that you will try these strategies and they can be beneficial for you as you re-enter the classroom, because they were for me. And that is my time. Come back next Sunday for another dose of inclusive and diversified classroom management 101. See you next time. Bye.